everybody, it's SKYRIM and welcome back to Storytime with Saskia, where this time I'm reading the first chapter, or the second chapter, whichever way you want to look at it, of my friend SKYRIM's fanfiction. It is called The Darkness Casts a Different Light, and I think the title changed in between when I read the prologue and now the first chapter. But we're just going to get into it, and I'm going to practice my reading a little bit more. Woohoo! Alright, let's go. Chapter 2. The Finding of Dim Hollow. The story began on a spring morning, particularly beautiful, particularly cold. Still pale sunlight infiltrated through the pine needles, and cast tall shadows across the frozen ground. Beyond the tree line, the mountains stood tall and dignified, sharp against the crisp blue sky. The day was clear, full of life. Birds sang prudently and mealy-mouthed in the trees, and the deer grazed on frosty grass in the hidden glades scattered about. Every forest dweller waited patiently for nature's awakening. In SKYRIM, at the very northernmost point of Tamriel, the weather fared this pleasant only rarely. But in Kynareth, I have trouble with these places, but I'm trying my best. But Kynareth had seen mercy upon the travellers that day, and blessed their journey with an auspicious warmth. Among the animals of the woods and the snowberries buried below a thin layer of snow, glazed oh my gosh, these sentences are so nice, but they are hard to read. But I'm trying my best. The prose is so pretty. Every time that I read this, I'm just so impressed. Among the animals of the woods and the snowberries buried below a thin layer of snow glaze, dwelt two hunters. They went swiftly and without difficulty, even if the terrain was difficult. The one walking in front was a male Nord, eyes blue like the cloudless sky, and arms strong and steady like tree trunks. He was the son of a farmer, and so sturdy and resilient. His name was Angmar, and despite his most modest upbringing, he carried himself with a poise only seen in his kin. Namit was the name of the young red guard following in his wake. She had big, keen eyes that held more experience than was fit for someone of her age. Unlike her companion, she displayed no sign of pride, if not for a certain steadfastness. Her hair was short, thick and curly, black like pine bark and barren soil. 23 winters had she seen, most of which long and difficult. The signs manifested themselves upon her, but she was not one to lament, nor ask for pity. Even now she came last, watching Angmar's back like the lead wolf, and the only bitterness lingering on her tongue came from the mead she had drank back in the camp. Vampire hunters by trade, they were both members of the Dawn Guard, a clerical militaristic order on a holy mission of eradicating the undead throughout SKYRIM. The guild has seen its vicissitudes. I don't know this word. What does this mean? Vicissitude. A change of circumstances or fortune, typically one that is unwelcome or unpleasant. Vicissitude. We are learning today, boys. The guild had seen its vicissitudes of fortune, ran into retirement once more. Even the past years had been naught but plentiful. But now, in the midst of the tensions of the Civil War, it was starting to regain a footing in the province, where people sought a way to escape in rising numbers. Angmar had only recently come into the garrison, but Namit had forever been a part of it, for her father Isran was their commander supreme. A former vigilant of Stendar, he had repurposed himself after the tragic loss of his wife and Namit's mother in an attack executed by a band of rogue vampires almost a decade ago. It would have been a lie, saying it never bothered her, or that the memory of her mother didn't haunt her in her dreams. But she had pretended to be strong for so long that she had forgotten she was pretended to be strong for so long that she had forgotten she was pretending. Isran had had it rough, and his daughter had never wanted to add to his load. Too quickly had she grown into a woman. Her training had begun properly at age 12. The year the last of her baby teeth had gone off, and the first leaves of autumn had mouldered. Her first kill she had executed at 7. She didn't like thinking about that, addressing it as it was, a burden, a vulnerability, something of a weakness. So she kept her adamancy, and lost a little bit of herself in each lie that she told herself. Gosh, I do love Namit and her character. The way that it's written is so, just really nuanced, and very relatable. Once they emerged from the trees, the mountain loomed formidable and unwavering before them. Somewhere hidden in its inclines was a cave, a specific cave they had been set out for. They called it Dim Hollow. The Dawn Guard had recently heard word of it being the burial site of something of high value and importance, and not a soul preferred to sit idly and wait for the enemy to get to it before they did. So Isran had sent out a most trusted protege, his own daughter, and the overly enthusiastic gnawed under her wing. But little was the respect Angmar had for Namit as his captain. He saw the orders not as duty, but as a chance in winning over her heart, for his infatuation with her was great. Alas for him, Namit couldn't have cared less. She would simply brush him off like dirt, posing not to see the longing in his gaze. Only each subtle rejection left a dark mark on his confidence, softening and spoiling his goodwill. After all, his pride was larger than his heart, and it was the most destructive of forces. The higher they got, the more their burden breathing drowned out the birdsong. There was a small footpath winding up the slope, treacherous and slippery, and stretched thin and hardly visible between the thickets. They followed it devoutly, looking back over the valley as its snow-covered mounds and hillocks every now and then, and getting discouraged from what little progress had been made. Somewhere, a fox as white as snow scurried into hiding as it heard them coming. The hunters were too busy climbing to notice. When they found the cave entrance, the sun already rose high in the sky. Both of decent fitness, they only needed a moment to catch their breaths before going in. The cave mouth was dark. A dark, unkind abyss, and Namit made sure to hold in the scent of conifers for a little longer than usual, should it prove to be her last. She was a seasoned fighter, and could measure to many a foe, but there was a wisdom in understanding the fragility of life, to cherish it where possible. It was an art known only by those who had ever lost anyone or anything. That life was never truly your own, that you belonged to the earth where you had once come from, and there in time, and there you shall in time return. Oh yeah, that's a very, very beautiful paragraph that I also relate to deeply. It's the fear of loss coated in poetry. Once we go in, stay close to the ground, instructed Namit briefly, and we mustn't speak, only when absolutely necessary. Angmar nodded, loading his crossbow. Aye, ma'am. Before they descended, they both withdrew their crossbows and held them ready in their grasp. Namit's grip of her weapon was steady. Her hands had grown used to handling it. She had faith in herself as a marksman, valued highly Angmar's strength and resilience in battle. The Red Guard was far from carefree, but she was patient and experienced, and with those came the solidity of a draw. From the cramped passage, Namid could hear the rush of water. The air inside was cold and damp, and her clothes clung to her skin. It kept getting darker until it suddenly became bright again, as the two came out of the tunnel and into a cave. They took a moment to reorient themselves, to scour the surroundings for enemies. Namid's cheek was pressed against the chiller of her crossbow, which had left a soft line crossing in her face from nose to ear. They were now on a ledge overlooking a cave hollow. A waterfall surged down from an orifice in the ceiling, and much further down, below a small yet fierce stream cut through the floor. Frost splashed upon the rock, and it slid down the slope and doused it. Namid caught speech first. Then she saw them through the foaming whitecaps. 2 vampires standing on the other side of the cavern, speaking and laughing gleefully, unaware of their audience. The Red Guard knew by now the nuances in which vampires often spoke. She gestured at Angmar to take cover, which the Nord willingly obeyed. Killing a vampire required skill and precision, and there was little space for mistakes. Even a whelp like him knew that. Soon after the hunters realized they had come into a problem. The vampires were not alone. Not 1, but 2 death hounds kept watch beside their feet. The sight of them made Namid freeze and reconsider. By now, she had gotten well adjusted to killing vampires, but their vile pets were stronger, faster, and more alert, thus more dangerous than their masters. After meticulously scanning the area to be sure, the Red Guard shot at the other animal. Angmar followed her suit. A death hound was one ill-looking creature. It had hairless, putrid black skin, and a wicked grin made of teeth like razors. Now, Tamriel was home to some foul beasts, but these things were more than just ugly. They had given nightmares to many battle-hardened warriors, and bred tales to keep children from venturing out in the woods. Namid's stomach stirred, not because she was afraid to die, which she could still do with honor. She feared the monster that was failure. By now she had carried out dozens of missions, most of which had been successful. For years she had been on the field, clearing out vampire nests and working as an undercover agent, taking out the ones having infiltrated into courts and palaces. For that she was proud of herself. She knew herself to be swift and agile, an indomitable soldier, but miscarriage she could not take, nor the disappointment from her father. God, I feel like I'm stumbling over my words a lot, but these this is some really, really beautiful prose, and I wish I could read it better, but that's why we're here, to learn. I'll get there. The Red Guard pressed a finger down on the trigger and jerked slightly from the violent jolt of the crossbow. Angmar's actions were an echo of hers, but where Namid's bolt hit its target, he missed by an inch or 2. A spasm of panic hit her. There was not much one could do in the fracture of a second in which the remaining beast would catch their scent. Indeed, it hurled at them with the speed of light. She could see a grim form dive out of the shadow, hear claws scratch against dampened stone. Her crossbow's weakness lay in its slow reloading time, so neither of them could retake the blow before the hound was upon her. She was prepared. Her stance was broad and sure-footed, yet it threw her off balance with ease. It bashed the Red Guard's spine against the rock. She winced from the pain, but her senses overcame it as adrenaline spread to her system. She pressed the bridle of her crossbow against the hellhound's throat. She could hear her own pulse ticking in her ear, and a drop of sweat trickled down her forehead and onto the ground. Rows of jagged teeth clamped the air mere inches from the hunter's face. Drool fell from the jaws, all too eager to know the taste of her flesh. Angmar reassembled himself, He then held his crossbow soundly, letting off and hitting the hound in the neck. It was no easy shot, for he did not want to injure Namit, and her and the beast's shapes became a blur as she kept struggling under it. But he hit anyway, and his bolt plunged the creature off her body. It toppled over and whined once before laying still. Namit's fingers grasped instinctively for her throat as she breathed shallow and quickly, barely able to bring herself to move. Not a moment too soon, she panted out. Her relief was short-lived. They now had the vampire's undivided attention, and there was no time to lay to waste. The monsters now ran through the same trail as the hounds had a minute ago, faces writhing in a ferocious rage and hands raised and charged with magic. It was not Namit's first nor last time interacting with these spells. She was well versed with the vampire diseases and knew the fate that awaited her were she to contract one. Without exception, all of them inexorably led to vampirism, and if left untreated, to her it was a fate worse than death. So she jumped back on her feet, encouraged not only by the painful memories of her fallen brothers in arms, but also because she had sworn to keep Angmar safe, no matter the cost. Namit carried a sense of responsibility over everyone she travelled with. She would have forever given her own life to save another. She was, at the core, as much a martyr as she was a fighter. I love the characterization of her here. Like, she's really noble, and at the same time, she just does not know it. She's very insecure, but she's she's very selfless as well. But the only reason she's being selfless is because she feels like that's what she's supposed to do, right? It's hardly a choice, and still she does it. She grabbed her crossbow tightly before sending a bolt to pierce the air and hit the other vampire square in the chest. The shot was so clear his bones barely made a sound, but his screams rang loud and blood-curdling across the cavern, bargaining with the hollowed steel of the Dawn Guard. But his pleas were heard by none other than his master and father in Cold Harbour. Namit spat out and wiped the sweat and dirt off her face. The hubbub of heart ceased in her ear. She could now focus on their surroundings, the pulpy moss climbing the walls and the pungent odor of mold. Before the gate at the end of the descent, where the vampires had first stood and talked, 3 corpses lay, 2 vampires and a single vigilant. Even from afar, Namit could tell it was Tolan. He had shown up at the fortress a few days ago and declared his intentions to investigate Dim Hollow for himself. Isran had not believed him. He had always told her that the vigilants were cowards, spineless sheep without a shepherd. Only now it appeared he had been wrong, and underestimated the strength of will of one of Stendar's own. Despite her father's dissatisfaction with the vigilance, Namit hoped she would have been wrong about the corpse's identity. As they drew near, she saw the look of horror on his face, in a body drained dry. Her forehead creased. The red guard crouched down and cited out a short parting prayer, closing his eyes and crossing his stiff hands over his chest, right below the amulet he had carried in Stendar's name. "Walk forever in the light," sighed she, glancing over her shoulder, looking at Angmar, but not quite in his eyes. She added, "We should keep moving." Much to Namit's disappointment, the iron gate before them shook, still in between them and the way forth. Much to Namit's disappointment, the iron gate before them stood shook, still between them and the way forth. There was no opening mechanism at hand. None her eyes could reach, at least. After a short and fruitless search, her attention was drawn to the ruins of a tower, reaching dauntlessly towards the skyless ceiling on the other side of the cavern. The path to it was dangerous, and while Namit held her agility at great degree, she wasn't immune to the wetness of the stone. Angmar grabbed her by the arms and held her still. She did initially feel gratitude towards his courtesy, but instead of flustering her, it left a persistent feel of indifference and awkwardness. They had their own history. It wasn't much, but enough for Namid to lull herself into a false sense of success. At least to him, she was worthy of admiration and love. But she had kept him at bay, close but not close enough to suffocate her, even if it made her grovel in guilt. The Red Guard had never cared to marry, and she had certainly not believed in love, or the revolutionary bliss people would describe it. To her, it was a task and a necessary evil, something that was expected of her with held breath. But as time passed on, she had begun to find out how unpleasant it was to be courted, and his endless attempt in seducing her, in this way, she felt unwell, sickly, like a flower in bloom that had its roots eaten by rot. That is beautiful. I really like that, and it's also, again, extremely relatable. Namit cleared her throat and gathered her legs below, moving away from him as soon as she was capable of. She was here on a mission, not to kindle a flame she felt forced to attend to. Ooh, okay, I really like that line a lot. That was cool. But she couldn't stop thinking about it. The thought gnawed at the corners of her mind and begged her to look, no matter how firmly she turned her away from it. She quickened her pace and entered the crumbling tower. Angmar's jaw clenched. He followed directly at her heel. His mind was encumbered too. But when she felt guilty, he was frustrated, angry, entitled to the attention he was denied. The spire was cramped on the inside. It was laid out in 2 levels, both of which had a single room. If Angmar was able to spread out his arms, he would have been able to touch both inner walls. Namit leapt up the old rotten stairwell and found a rusty pull chain sitting at the top. She drew it fully, even if the chain grated and gristled at her ear. A small tapered window offered a vantage point over the cavern. She saw from it that the gate at the front crumbled open. The two then traced back their steps and entered the hallway, having no choice but to step knee-deep into the underground river they had seen and heard earlier. They soon got wet, wading through its current, and with water dripping down on them from the ceiling. The collars of their boots chafed uncomfortably against their calves. Every now and then they came to a halt. If the stream came too strongly, or gear too heavy. The two lingered in quite the different thoughtscapes. Namit pondered on the mission and the purpose of the gate, daring not to question the intentions of whoever was responsible for sealing the place away. She thought of her father and how badly she depended on his approval. She felt uncertain about being the captain of his forces, and dwelled on the time she had to suppress her self-will and sharpness of tongue to mend and mold to his liking. She found the silence preferable. Angmar, on the other hand, wanted to speak up. He wanted to say something sweet, his mind wild and wandering, but he heeded to his thoughts. Mustn't scare her off, the Nord thought. There's still a chance. I don't like him. Along with the juniper berry tarts his mother had used to make, he dreamt of marriage, and it was to Namit. He respected her father and considered him a man. He would gladly and with grace follow, and in his heart he fully believed their union would be plenteous and would be plenteous in its beautificity. The temperature around them kept falling. Chills ran down Namit's spine, ruffled ruffled the hair on her neck. Above them, sarcophagi loomed on the edges of the passage like an ancient council, ready to pass judgment. That's a really cool visual, I think. Very cool. The world they momentarily shared with the small, nearly blind cave critters, was greyish-brown and green, limestone and moss. Water dribbled down from the cracks and crevices in the wall. The air was heavy with humidity and an unexplainable sense of melancholy, and only the sound of their legs delving into the soft, wet earth sounded across the passage. Also a very beautiful line. There's so many beautiful lines there, oh my goodness. If I were to call it out every time I saw one, we would never get anywhere. Slowly, the two hunters regained their spirits, jesting a little, carefully. The cave teemed with creatures big and small, but there were fewer fangs and a great many more skeletons than they had initially anticipated. Namit was an excellent monster hunter. She could handle vampires and even deathhounds with little issues. But when she saw the carcass of a frostbite spider lying still on their way, she suddenly felt like a young girl again. She hoped they wouldn't come across paths with a live one, but as they pursued that goal, they passed more and more webbing and egg sacs, so her worry grew along with each crook in the tunnel. They then came upon a ledge which perched over the path they had cleared. Someone had built a large railing around it, almost to ensure the safety of the overseer. Namit found it curious, but oddly sweet. She peeked from within its rectangular slots, casting her gaze down where the river cast downwards along the tunnel. They were out of the sludge now. The safety railing reminded her of her childhood, of the lessons by the lake in the Dayspring Valley, and how Isran had never allowed her to swim too far. It occupied her with a strange somberity that could best and only be described as homesickness. But she couldn't ponder on it for much longer, for the arising sounds of struggle wafted into her ears. Instinctively, the Red Guard lowered herself, assembling and preparing herself for combat. The executioners of the noise were far from discreet. A giant frostbite spider bared its fangs against a vampire, caught up in a battle of wills. The hairs on the spider stood erect as it prepared to sting its opponent. Like twin swords, its large venomous canines ripped and tore at the enemy's flesh. The hunters withdrew to each side of the doorway, waiting patiently for the situation to play out without interfering. From their covers, they made playful faces at the sound of battle until they grew quiet. Upon a glance, they found that the spider had died, and the vampire sat in a half-lying position before it. He held to his side, where a deep wound stalled him from moving. Namit saw her chance. She withdrew from cover, got down on one knee, steadied her hand, and shot. Then came a moment of respite. The hunter sighed and laughed a little out of weariness. It had been hours, and the exact time was lost to them. Even if they were nearing an end now, Namit felt restless, far from relieved. It worsened when she felt Angmar lay his hand over her shoulder, and she moved away as soon as she deemed appropriate. But the Nord's forehead puckered. He fell silent and rolled around in self-pity. He tortured himself with the thoughts of shame and inadequacy, but it couldn't get farther from the truth. And he could have been the High King of SKYRIM and the kindest, goodest man in all on Tamriel, yet the level of her interest would have remained the same. Only he could not comprehend it. With a quivering hand, Namit pushed open the door before them. A gust of cold air crashed unapologetically against their faces, and the Red Guard fought a coughing fit that hitched in her throat. Once inside, Angmar closed the door behind them. Namit assured there were no longer traps scattered about, and that the ground was safe to tread. There were sounds of a distant conversation, but it echoed across the grand chamber. It was a vast, natural cave with a centerpiece of sorts on a lone island. Neither of them could recognize the architecture. It was so old that it must have dated back to the ancient Nords, but the style didn't appear Nordic at all, and rather came closer to some of the alien ruins. Namit felt in her heart that they were close to discovering something unfathomable. Anticipation tingled at the tips of her fingers and the bottoms of her feet, picked at the edges of her thought. Only a little further, she thought. Back then to bed and warm bread and cold ale. There were 2 vampires in the area. They were keeping busy with a corpse, toying with it like a pair of cats would with a rat. The body lay in a pool of darkened blood, sticky and tar-like. Multiple wounds crossed his flesh. Namit knew them by his death had not been. Namit knew by them his death had not been gentle, nor had it been fast. Her mouth was dry as she swallowed. It took her a moment to adjust to the horrors that surrounded her. She felt an anger so bottomless and hungry she did not know what to do with it. All she could do was close her eyes and pretend to be unbothered. What is it they're saying? Angmar asked through gritted teeth. He did not go further, but fell against his exclusion. Namit turned over her shoulder and motioned for him to remain quiet, for they had still gone unnoticed. She then showed him which vampire to aim for. It was a simple plan, but something got lost in the translation, and the instructions were in vain. The Red Guard watched in terror as the remaining creature grimaced, eyes full of animalistic rage. Without hesitation, he dashed forward, chanting words in a language unknown to them both. Oh, great, hissed out Namit. It came out more aggressively than intended. Angmar caught it, but remained silent, springing to the ledge and pressing his body to the wall. The Red Guard hid behind the doorframe, waiting for the situation to play out. It was a nerve-wracking bait, and Namit tapped the hilt of her crossbow to keep her heartbeat steady and controlled. 1, 2, 3. Then something happened, and the Nord's impatience betrayed him. He abandoned his cover and leaped out in a moment too early. Namit watched in a slow fright how the vampire raised his arm and plunged a dagger into Angmar's bicep. She winced at the sight of blood soaking through the fabric, and the suckling sound as the blade retracted from the flesh. The Nord grunted from the pain, and his hand instinctively flew to the open wound, face writhing in pain. But the vampire laughed, and his belittling laugh rang in Namit's ears for years to come. He tried to grab Angmar by his neck, but the trigger finger surpassed his speed. A vile, wet sound came from the bolt cleaving through his brain. The beast fell unconscious, staggered backwards, and took a tumble down the stairwell. Breathless, the Red Guard stared down at the dead vampire, as if to ensure he was indeed dead. Then she turned around to see Angmar, who sat on the ground and heaved through a grin. His crossbow lay on the ground beside his bent knee. His hand was still rested over the wound, but it didn't deter blood from oozing through his fingers. The fabric of his upper arm and body had blackened. "Stendar's mercy," Namit muttered in worry. "Can you walk?" "Of course," spoke the Nord. "Just need me a moment. There, toss my bag." The Red Guard turned around. Angmar's belt bag had gone off and rolled across the ground. Half of its contents were emptied. She scooped everything back and brought it to the Nord then. He dug around into it with a pained expression, pulling out a frosted bottle of cryolic brandy. Namit raised her eyebrows questioningly. Where the Nord had acquired such an expensive and rare imperial import, she did not know. He cocked the back of his head and chugged it down with a shaky hand, then wiped dry the corners of his mouth with a sour expression. That was a really cool line, like the way that one was just constructed. He then pulled aside the strip of his gambeson, revealing angry red skin and the oozing wound before spilling some alcohol over it. Boggling at the pain, he did not spare his curses. Namit watched in uneasy silence. Only when he felt well enough to breathe properly and lay down the bottle could she grant him a careful smile, one he did not replicate. You good? Namit asked him as he prized himself up. He heaved quite a bit, and the wound still hurt, without a doubt. Dunno, maybe we should rest a while. Nay, hissed Angmar. The sooner we're out, all the better. Damn place. Namit nodded. As soon as she could walk again, they made their way down the weathered stairwell. The Red Guard admired the stonework, but alas, no creation of man withstood the ravages of time. Ooh, okay, I like that. That was cool. She would occasionally turn around and ensure her companion's safety. Besides a slight limp, he appeared to be doing okay, but she just couldn't shake the worry. Once they got to the crumbling bridge, their footfalls sounded throughout the empty space. There was a circular platform built over a subterranean lake. It had a single central column with sharp peaked marble arches circling it, dimly shimmering braziers interlocking smallly with the arches. A single button atop the lone pillar in the middle. It was made of gold, instilled in a darkened metal frame, and its center was hollow. Not a single plant grew there. Below their feet, the water sat in complete darkness. If they were to stop now and listen, they would have known a silence unprecedented. But they were tired and down to them. They were tired and down to the marrow, and thus had naught to spare for the wonders of the world. That's also a really cool line. The button called for Namit, itched at her fingers. It could have been an easy trap. She had been taught better than the curiosity she now felt. I should be the one to do it, suggested Angmar valiantly. Namit's insides squirmed unpleasantly at his tone. They will need you much more than they need me, if something goes amiss. The Red Guard breathed out her frustration. No, she spoke firmly. Listen, we're equals, you and me. But here, in the field, I am your superior, and as such will be taking any weight on any associated risks. That clear? Angmar's stomach stirred from a bruised ego, but even he knew not to press the matter further. Good, answered Namit. She cleared her throat, shifting back her focus to the pillar. She swung her arms through the air once or twice, letting the worries roll down from her fingertips. She was hesitant to let Angmar see through her false confidence. Then she went for it. As soon as she had laid her hand upon the button, a sharp, penetrating pain shot through her. The Red Guard held back a startled yelp. Eyes locked around the spike sprung up from the bottom hollow. The spike sprung up from the button, hollow and pierced through her hand. It retracted as quickly as it had emerged, leaving thick, fresh blood trickling down her fingers. She couldn't stifle the shock on her face. Despite the initial blood loss, the seepage calmed down soon, and Amid could only assume it was due to a numbing salve, or some other solution doused upon it. It was tactical, the entire system, planned down to the last digit, and despite the terror, she could easily find herself admiring the grand design. Her intrigued gaze followed as the blood got sucked down the drain. In a heartbeat, it had run through a web of troughs by their feet and connected the braziers. And before either could open their mouth to speak, they were cloaked in an otherworldly purple haze that shone from the channels. It was now far from grim. Namit's eyes grew wide in fascination. She could feel the place's energy pulsating through her as she beheld its strange beauty, taking a few steps back, careful not to step over the blood flow. Won't you look at that? Spoke Angmar. Caught ourselves a riddle. You don't say, answered Namit with a hushed tone. The Red Guard nudged the brazier closest to her, to which the shred of light led to. Aye, you can move these braziers. Come on, give me a hand, she instructed, watching as the one she had her grip on slid into the next station. The purple light gushed forward and showered the area in its arcane essence. Namit felt more a spirit than a puzzle. It was enthralling. The two disappeared into a deep silence filled with naught but the rumbling of braziers. They moved about and pushed him to and fro, and cursed when one got stuck and refused to move. It was a onerous task, since the vessels got heavy and got very heavy after a while. Then, when the circle at last connected, Nemid watched in awe as the amethystine pattern wrapped around the center like a giant angular serpent. The ground began to shift and move, and the floor beneath them appeared to sink. The Red Guard trundled back alarmedly, hoping to herself that what they had discovered now was not only valuable in gold, but also an asset in their mission. The divines only knew how they needed that. The earth shook as a large stone monolith emerged from the recess, shaking and terrorizing to the very ground they stood upon. It raised a quake strong enough to loosen the stalactites hanging from the ceiling, and the thinnest ones rained down like a hail of stone. As the thinnest ones rained down like a hail of stone, they both raised their arms to shield themselves. Luckily for them, it only lasted for a few seconds. When the two hunters stood steady over the ground still and stable once more, they exchanged a questioning look, the first one in a while. The dust settled around them, allowing for them to see before them properly. Nemid coughed, flicking her wrist through the air in an attempt to clear her eyesight. Once she had regained her vision, she studied the monolith carefully. Without much hesitation, she reached out her hand and touched its cold, rough surface. She didn't get to wondering about its holdings before the stone started to quiver. It slid open laboriously, like a door with rusted hinges, allowing for light to enter for the first time in centuries. In hindsight, Nemid had thought this over and over again, but she could never again remember her own expectations. Maybe she had anticipated a weapon, a sword or a mace to smite the evil with, or an artifact, one with ancient power sealed within. But there was one thing for certain. If there was one thing for certain, it was that the mysterious woman emerging from within had not been once a thought even close to occurring. The woman fell, but she caught herself before she could plummet to the ground. She carried a large artifact sheathed on her back, and even Nemid could see an interest to it. It was difficult for the Red Guard to see all that well in the dying purple glow, but as soon as the stranger cast her gaze upwards, Nemid's heart skipped a beat. She knew by the glow of her eyes, by the white, hot pupil in the middle of an iris made of fire. A vampire. She struggled to stand up straight, but once she did, she hovered above them both. She was dizzy. Nemid could tell from the way her eyes wandered. She gathered herself fast, but the hunter was faster. She clutched onto her crossbow and pointed its stirrup towards the woman. Who are you?" said the stranger. Her voice faltered, as if her throat was very dry. The red eyes inspected their surroundings, but heeded the hunters without disruption. The next time she spoke, her voice was clearer. "Who sent you?" "None of your concern," Nemid replied sternly. She struggled to keep her surprise to herself. "How about we do the asking, and you will do nicely to respond? I just so happen to be very light on the trigger." "What? No," began the vampire, but her voice ceased then. She fell deep in thought, lifting her jaw a little to appear more of a threat, but she did not evoke fear in her discoverers. She found by glancing them up and down. "Please, I fail to follow. Why would anyone who isn't like me be here?" "Like you," said Angmar. His tone was agitated, and Nemid cast him a reassuring glance. "You really can't tell?" The vampire's perplexed gaze travelled from Nemid to the Nord and back to Nemid again. "A vampire?" Then Angmar raised his crossbow and held the tiller to his face, ready to pull the trigger. If Nemid hadn't prevented him from doing so, his bolt would have already slain the stranger, but the Red Guard's kindness saved her then. Angmar gave his commander a questioning look. He stared deep into her eyes as if to ask why, but the meat's gaze was restless and unnegotiable. She then became overcome with thought. The hunter lowered her own weapon and took quick short steps into the opposing direction, searching the shadowed ground for an answer. But once again, none was offered for her, and she felt so astonishingly troubled for having to decide for herself. "The Dawn Guard would want me to kill you," Namit said at last. She huffed, turning around and giving the vampire a thorough glance. This was only the half-truth. This was only half the truth. They would have wanted her to take her captive, drain her drive what she knew, and then kill her. Maybe I should. Maybe you should try and give me a real cognate reason not to. Let's hear it. The stranger chuckled. Not fond of vampires, are they? Or you? Her head was starting to clear from the dust it bore for years, and as she grew more and more used to being awake again after what had felt like an eternity, she could feel a hunger stir in her stomach, and she could feel their heartbeats, and sensed his tense, short breath as he stared at her like an injured fawn in front of a dire wolf. In a way, she enjoyed it. The way his fear became tangible. But Namit's heartbeat didn't twitch, and it didn't budge. She had a calculative look in her eye, one the vampire could not so easily read. The hunter's eyebrows knitted together. She knew her kind by now, could detect all the hidden nuances from which the vampire's body language, even how heady her voice was, fondling her ears sweetly, like a kiss. She could not see past it, but she could see past her trickery, and thus held an advantage over the lethargic vampire. The stranger before her sighed, leaning slightly to the monolith. Then she begged, "No, listen. I've no wish to die here, and you're clearly in pursuit of something. Kill me, and you've killed one vampire. Great. Well done. A pat on the back from me. But if there are people looking for me, something must have happened while I was, asleep." Namit's brow furrowed further. After giving the sarcophagi a sorrowful glance, Sarana cast her a pleading look. The vampire then spoke firmly and without doubt. "I can help you figure it out." A silence fell. The hunter contemplated on the vampire's offer, and Angmar's demanding gaze upon her did not make the feat easier. This wasn't her deal to make. It was arrogant and against her given orders. She was completely torn between duty and a sheer, wild curiosity. No matter how the time passed them by, there was no lesson of her father she could cite, no voice of reason whispering truths into her ear. So she let her shoulders fall from the tension they had been holding, and gave the vampire a stiff nod of affirmation. "Fine. It is settled then," Namit said dryly. She did not trust the vampire to any extent, and the truce was as thin as a streak of spider's web, but it was a truce nonetheless. "But you should know better than to get in our way." The stranger's eyes flew open with surprise. There was a sense of tension between them still. One walked in silence and distrust. Hearts and minds heavy, they both accepted the challenge. And somewhere under every prejudice, mistrust and fear, neither could deny how irresistibly curious they felt about one another. The vampire that resisted a bottomless hunger, and the hunter that had failed to bring down her prey. Perhaps it was done in the name of fairness and justice, or perhaps it was primal, the lust for survival. Either way, it was now to be executed. Perhaps it was destined, thought Namit with a distress in her chest. Or this is oblivion I'm hurtling into. Only time would tell. "Oh, and before I forget, my name's Sarana." The vampire's voice became exalted now that some of her trepidation had faded. She spoke in an archaic dialect. Oh, archaic, I know that word. She spoke in an archaic dialect, one that the Mede found a little tricky to follow, but which indicated a long time spent asleep. For how long exactly, she could not begin to guess. Whom do I have the most pleasure of talking to? Namit, responded the Hunter morosely. My name is Namit. Ooh, okay. That was a long chapter. Almost an hour, my goodness. Oh, no wonder my throat's dry. Oh, that was cool though. Oh my goodness. I love how my friend is so good at making even just the littlest of things or the most mundane things so beautiful. Like, not even like super interesting necessarily, but like really beautifully and poetically described. Just like they're just walking down a crypt, and I've no doubt that in the video game you're just running through it, right? You're not noticing anything, like the moss on the wall, or like, you know, a little trickle of a stream here and there. It's just all those details described in such a what even is the word for that, romantic, in such a romantic way. It's extremely poetic. That is a very beautiful writing style. Unfortunately a little bit difficult to pronounce every now and then, just because the words are used so like artistically, I guess. That is not in any way a bad thing. It's just that the sentences are more complicated than he stood up and he walked to the door and he opened the door, so that makes it a little bit more difficult to read, but that is just the challenge that I'm here for. I thought it went okay. I stumbled a lot more than I would have liked, but I think I'm starting to learn a little bit more, and it was probably better than the last time I read. Anyway, I think that's where I'm going to end it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching it all the way to the end, and if you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe to this YouTube channel for more art videos every single Friday. Have a great weekend, guys, and keep on sketching. Bye!